Good morning. Today we're doing the French and Indian War. Timeline connection. From 1754 to 1763, while Benjamin Franklin was becoming famous throughout Europe for his scientific discoveries and wise writings, the American colonists found themselves thrust into their first great military adventure. They would fight alongside British soldiers in a massive conflict that stretched across the North American continent, learning lessons about warfare, unity, and their own capabilities that would prove invaluable in the greater struggle that lay ahead. Some key dates: 1754 to 1763, the French and Indian War. 1754, Washington's first battle. 1759, the Battle of Quebec. The clash of two great empires. Picture the vast wilderness of North America in the 1750s and try to imagine its incredible scope and beauty. Endless forests of oak, maple, and pine stretched across from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Mississippi River, broken only by sparkling rivers, crystal clear lakes, and the occasional small settlement where brave pioneers have carved out homes in the wilderness. This magnificent continent was about to become the battleground where two great European empires, Britain and France, would fight for control, and the American colonists would find themselves caught in the middle of a conflict that would change their lives forever. The French and Indian War would be the first major conflict that taught the American colonists how to be soldiers. It was called the French and Indian War because the colonists and British soldiers fought against the French and their Native American allies. But this war would do much more than just determine who controlled North America. It would prepare the colonists for an even greater struggle that lay ahead, teaching them that they could work together, fight bravely, and accomplish things that they had never thought possible. The seeds of conflict. Both Britain and France had been eyeing the rich, fertile lands west of the 13 colonies for many years, and both empires wanted to control these territories for very different reasons. The French had been in North America for over a century, building a chain of forts and trading posts that stretched like a great arc from the frozen wilderness of Canada down through the Great Lakes region and along the mighty Mississippi River all the way to the warm, humid city of New Orleans. They called this vast territory New France, and they dreamed of creating a great empire in the heart of the continent. But the French approach to colonize was very different from the British way of doing things. Instead of bringing a large number of settlers to clear the land and build farms and towns, the French sent traders and missionaries who lived among the Native Americans, learning their languages and customs. French traders, called coureurs de bois, which means runners of the woods, would disappear into wilderness for months at a time, living like Indians, marrying Indian women, and becoming part of a tribal community. This approach made the French very popular with many Native American tribes. The French bought furs from the Indians at fair prices and didn't try to take their land away from them. They respected Indian customs and religious beliefs, and many Indians converted to Christianity through the patient work of French missionaries who lived among them and learned to speak their language. The British colonists, on the other hand, had a completely different vision for North America. They wanted land, and lots of land, for farming and settlement. As their population grew from thousands to hundreds of thousands, they pushed steadily westward, clearing forests, plowing fields, and establishing new towns and settlements. This often meant taking land that Native Americans had used for hunting and farming for countless generations, and it created tensions that would explode into violence. A young man named Washington When tensions between Britain and France began to escalate in the Ohio River Valley, that crucial region where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers came together to form the mighty Ohio River, the governor of Virginia decided that something had to be done. He would send a message in the French telling them politely but firmly to leave what the British considered to be British territory. For this important and dangerous mission, Governor Robert Dinwiddie chose a young man who was only 21 years old but had already shown remarkable leadership qualities and physical courage. His name was George Washington, and though he didn't know it at the time, this mission would be the first step in a career that would make him one of the most famous men in world history. Washington's journey to the French fort in the winter of 1753 was incredibly dangerous and required the kind of courage that few young men possess. He had to travel hundreds of miles through trackless wilderness, crossing frozen rivers on makeshift rafts, sleeping in the snow, and facing the constant threat of attack by hostile Indians who might kill him simply for being in their territory. When Washington finally reached the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf, he delivered his message with the dignity and courage of a much older and more experienced man. The French commander, Captain Jacques Lagarde de Saint-Péray, received Washington politely and treated him with the respect due to an official representative of the British government. But his answer was polite and firm. The French had as much right to the Ohio Valley as the British did, and they had no intention of leaving. Washington returned to Virginia with the disappointing news, but his courage and leadership during the dangerous mission impressed everyone who heard about it. Here was a young man who could be trusted with important responsibilities, who could keep his head in dangerous situations, and who had the kind of natural authority that made other men want to follow him. The first battles. The following year, in 1754, Washington was sent back to the Ohio Valley, this time with a small army of Virginia soldiers to build a fort at the strategic location where the rivers came together. But when Washington and his men arrived, they found that the French had beaten them to it. The French had already built their own fort at this crucial spot and named it Fort Duquesne, in honor of their governor. Washington's first battle as a military commander was a disaster that taught him hard lessons about warfare. His small force was surrounded and defeated by a combined army of French soldiers and their Indian allies. Washington had to surrender his makeshift fort, which he had named Fort Necessity. But even in defeat, he showed the kind of character that would make him a great leader. He took responsibility for the defeat, learned from his mistakes, and began to understand the enormous differences between European-style warfare and the kind of fighting that was necessary in the American wilderness. The war spreads across the world. What had started as a small conflict between Virginia soldiers and French troops in the Ohio Valley quickly grew into a massive war that was fought not only in North America, but literally around the world. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War, and battles were fought in Germany, India, the Caribbean islands, and on the high seas where British and French warships battled for control of the ocean trade routes. Britain sent thousands of regular soldiers to America to fight the French, professional soldiers with bright red uniforms, precise military drill, and years of experience fighting European wars. These soldiers were impressive to look at as they marched in perfect formation with their muskets gleaming in the sun and their regimental flags flying proudly in the breeze. But there was one serious problem. They had been trained to fight European-style battles on open fields, not the kind of wilderness warfare that was necessary in the dense forests of America. The French and their Indian allies, on the other hand, were masters of forest fighting. They had learned from the Indians how to move silently through the woods, how to use every tree and rock for cover, and how to appear suddenly from behind trees, attack with devastating effect, and then disappear back into the forest before their enemies could respond. Time and again, British forces marched in neat formations, were ambushed and defeated by enemies they could barely see. Braddock's defeat, the most shocking defeat of the early war in 1755, when British General Edward Braddock led a large, well-equipped army to capture Fort Duquesne. General Braddock was a brave and experienced officer who had fought in many European wars, but he made a fatal mistake. He refused to adapt his tactics to American conditions. He insisted on fighting the way he had always fought, with soldiers marching in neat lines and following European rules of warfare. When Braddock's army was ambushed just a few miles from Fort Duquesne, the result was catastrophic. The British soldiers, trained to fight in formation, were helpless against an enemy that attacked from behind trees and rocks. The army was almost completely destroyed, and General Braddock himself was mortally wounded, dying only a few days later. George Washington, who served as one of Braddock's aides, showed remarkable courage during this disaster. As the British army fled in panic, Washington helped organize the retreat and probably saved many lives. He had 2 horses shot out from under him and found 4 bullet holes in his coat, but he was not wounded. Once again, he learned an important lesson about the difference between European and American warfare, lessons that would serve him well into the future. The tide turns. For the first few years of the war, the French won most of the battles. Their Indian allies controlled the frontier, and British settlements from Pennsylvania to Georgia lived in constant fear of attack. Families would go to bed at night not knowing if they would wake up to find their homes in flames and their loved ones killed or captured. It seemed like France might win control of all of North America. But in 1757, a new British leader named William Pitt came to power in London, and everything began to change. Pitt was a brilliant man who understood that this war was about much more than just a few forts in American wilderness. It was about which nation would dominate the world for generations to come. He was willing to spend whatever it took to win, and he had the vision and determination to see the war through to victory. Pitt sent more soldiers and ships to America than had ever been seen before. He also chose better generals and gave them the freedom to adapt their tactics to American conditions. Most importantly, he convinced the American colonists to support the war effort enthusiastically by promising to reimburse them for their expenses and by treating them as valuable partners rather than inferior subjects. The fall of Quebec. The turning point of the entire war came in 1759 with the British assault on Quebec, the capital of New France. Quebec was one of the most beautiful cities in North America, built on high cliffs overlooking the majestic St. Lawrence River, and it was considered almost impossible to capture. The city was protected by strong walls, defended by experienced French soldiers, and commanded by the Marquis de Montcalm, one of France's ablest generals. The British commander chosen to capture the seemingly impregnable fortress was General James Wolfe, a young man of only 32 who was already famous throughout the British Empire for his courage and tactile brilliance. Wolfe was tall and thin, with red hair and a pale complexion that made him look almost sickly, but he possessed an iron will and a genius for warfare that made him one of Britain's greatest generals. For months, Wolfe tried to find a way to attack Quebec, but the French defenses seemed perfect. The city sat on the cliffs that rose straight up from the river, and every obvious approach was heavily fortified. Wolfe's soldiers and sailors could see the city tantalizingly close across the water, but they seemed to have no way to reach it. Finally, Wolfe discovered a narrow, winding path up the cliffs that was lightly guarded because the French thought it was too steep and dangerous for any army to use. On the night of September 12, 1759, Wolfe made one of the boldest decisions in military history. He would lead his soldiers up the treacherous path in complete darkness, trusting that they could reach the top without being discovered. Picture that incredible night. Thousands of British soldiers climbing silently up a narrow path in the darkness, each man knowing that one slip could send him tumbling to his death, and each man trusting his life to the courage and judgment of this young general. By dawn, the impossible had happened. The British army was on the Plains of Abraham, just outside Quebec's walls, where no enemy army was supposed to be able to go. The French commander, Montcalm, was shocked to see British soldiers where he thought no one could possibly be. He quickly assembled his army and attacked, hoping to drive the British back into the river before they could establish themselves. But Wolfe was ready. He had positioned his men perfectly, and when the French charged, the British delivered a devastating volley that shattered the French attack. In the battle that followed, both Wolfe and Montcalm were mortally wounded. As Wolfe lay dying on the battlefield, an officer ran up to tell him that the French were retreating and the city would soon be theirs. "Now God be praised, I will die in peace," Wolfe replied. His sacrifice had secured British victory in North America and changed the course of the world history. The war ends and changes everything. With the fall of Quebec, French resistance in North America collapsed like a house of cards. The war officially ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, which completely changed the map of North America. France gave up almost all of its North American territory. Britain gained Canada and all French lands east of the Mississippi River, while Spain, which had foolishly allied with France, was forced to give Florida to Britain. The French and Indian War had profound consequences for the American colonists that would shape their future in many ways they could never have imagined. Military experience. Thousands of colonists had served as soldiers and learned how to fight. They had gained confidence in their ability to defend themselves and have proven that American soldiers could be just as brave and effective as any in the world. Unity. For the first time, colonists from different regions had worked together towards a common goal. A Virginia planter and a Massachusetts merchant might serve in the same army and discover that they had more in common than they had thought. This experience of cooperation would prove invaluable in the struggle ahead. Debt. The war had been enormously expensive. Britain had spent a fortune defending the colonies and now expected the colonies to help pay for it. This expectation would soon lead would soon lead to new taxes that would make the colonists very angry. Western lands. With the French gone, the way seemed open for unlimited westward expansion. But Britain wanted to avoid expensive conflicts with Indians, forbade colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. This restriction frustrated many colonists who had fought in the war, partly for the chance to claim Western lands. Changed relationship. The colonists had fought bravely along British soldiers and expected to be treated as equal and partners in the empire. But many British officers and officials looked down on the colonist soldiers as inferior and continued to treat the colonists as second-class subjects rather than full partners. God's providence in the war. From a Christian perspective, we could clearly see God's hand working through the events of the French and Indian War. The British victory ensued that North America would be predominantly Protestant rather than Catholic, which would have profound implications for religious freedom and the development of American culture. It also prepared the colonists for the greater challenges that lay ahead by teaching them that they could work together effectively and accomplish great things when they were united in a common cause. The war also raised up leaders like George Washington, who learned invaluable lessons about military command, political leadership, and the importance of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. These lessons would prove crucial when Washington was later called to lead the Continental Army in an even more desperate struggle for independence. Looking ahead, the French and Indian War had cost Britain an enormous amount of money, more money than the British government had ever spent on anything before. To pay for this war and to maintain the large army that would be needed to defend the expanding empire, Britain would soon start taxing the American colonists in new and unprecedented ways. This decision would make the colonists very angry and would lead directly to the American Revolution. The military skills, the experience of working together, and the confidence in their own abilities that the colonists had gained during the French and Indian War would serve them well when they found themselves fighting not alongside British soldiers, but against them in their struggle for independence and self-government. The stage was being set for an even greater conflict, one that would test everything the colonists had learned about courage, unity, and trust in God's providence. The lesson of the French and Indian War would prove to be preparation for the greatest challenge in American history.